Good day everyone. This tutorial is going to be on variable length subnet mask VLSM subnetting. So the first thing I'll do is for me to make you understand how our subnet tables work. So we have a subnet table where we have room for our prefix length. We have total number of hosts for that prefix length. And the usable host for that prefix length. If you have this table, it will ease your task. So the first prefix length we work with is /24, and the total number of hosts, this includes all our usable hosts plus the network address and the broadcast address, and that's 256. And then the usable host now will now be 256 minus 2, because in usable hosts we don't make use of the network address and the broadcast address, so we have to deduct 2, and that's 254. The next will now be /25. /25, and for /25 we have 256 divided by 2, 128. 128 minus 2, 126. So I'm going to apply this to the others. So it usually stops at /30, because by the time you proceed, there will be no room for you to deduct 2 addresses. So that's why we stop at /30, because when we have /31, 4 divided by 2 is 2. So by the time the 2 will just be for network and broadcast address, and it will not give room for usable hosts. So that's why we don't have anything for beyond /30. So now this is what we should understand, and this subnet table, we call it a subnet table, is what we will use throughout our subnetting. Now I wanted to use blue. What's wrong with me today, my thing? So this is our subnet table. Now let's proceed with the topology given. We're given a topology that looks like this. 2 routers connected. That's what do you call this? A one link, sorry. And then switch and a PC. S1, PC1, S2, PC2, S3, PC3, S4, PC4. Right? So let's assign usable number of hosts to this. So for this we have, let's say for this network here, we have 50 hosts. And for this network here, we have, let's say, 70 hosts. For this network here, and use another color. For this network here, let's see, we have 24 hosts. And then for this particular network here, we have 8 hosts. And of course, the network that connects the 2 routers, that's the one link. When you hear one link, that's the network that connects 2 routers, or other routers, yes, 2 usually. It's, let's see, We have two already because this is network A and network B. I mean IP address of A and B, so we have two hosts. So we're going to make use of VLSM to subnet all these. How many networks do we have now? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. So we're going to subnet the topology into 5 networks. Subnet 0, subnet 1, subnet 2, subnet 3, subnet 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. We are going to subnet the topology into these 5 networks. The next thing we do now is assign. Usually the topology comes with an IP address, so we assign the IP address, network address, sorry, 192.168.11.0/24 will be the network address we assign to the topology. So we now create a table where we have our network address. Sorry, the first thing is not the network address, let's see. So for this table, the first thing we do is we have our number of hosts. That's the first thing you understand. Then if we have this number of hosts, the next thing is the network address for that number of hosts. And then the prefix length that comes with that network address. For now, these are the things we will need, although we will need more on our table. So let's first start analyzing them with this. Now, for us to know, let's look at our topology again and list out hosts that we have. We have 70 hosts, we have 24, we have 50. What else do we have? 70, 24, 58, and 2. So we are going to arrange them in descending order. So let me arrange hosts in descending order. Arrange hosts in descending order. So we then come here. So our first host will now be 70, the next will be 50, the next will be 24, 8, and finally 2. So let's arrange them. So for S0, it is 70. For S1 will now be 50. For S2 will be 24. For S3 will be, sorry, I'm not good at drawing lines, so bear with me. Let me try another perfect one. So for S3 will be 8. And for S4, it will be 2. So this is it. Now, given our number of hosts, we'll then check for the network address. For S0, we will use the network address given to us, but we will not use the prefix length rather. We are going to make use of this network address here for S0. By standard, that's what you should do. Your first subnet uses the main network address given. So we have 192.168.11.0. Now, the prefix length, this/24 is not going to be used. Rather, we'll go to the subnetting table and check the number of hosts that we have. This host serves as the usable host. So where 70 falls under our usable host, we'll then check for the prefix length. So 70 falls under /25. Remember, this is our usable host. usable host. So 70 falls under here. So, and that's slash 25. So you come back to your table and you write slash 25 for your prefix length, slash 25. So the next thing you do is now check for S1, that's 50. So we go back to our table. Where does 50 fall under? 50 falls under slash 26, that's 62 usable hosts. So you come back and then you assign the prefix length of slash 26. Oh, we haven't added our network address. Now, the network address for S1, let me write the formula for you. Given A, that's our first network address. Network address of B is equal to network address of A plus total host increment of A. Now, A, now for here, our A is S0, and we're given a network address of 192.168.11.0. So we then check now for us to get the network address of B. We then see network address of A, that is 192.168.11.0 plus total host increment of A. Now what is our total host increment? You go back to your subnetting table under the total host increment of 70 hosts. You look at 70 usable hosts. That's here. Our 70 usable hosts fall under slash 25. What is the total number of hosts? This is where we have our increment for total. This is an increment. This is an increment. It depends on what you need. So 70. So our increment is 128. That's total number of host increments. Remember, you have to differentiate them. There's total number of host increments, there's usable host increments. So for our network address, we add in total number of host increments, and that's 128, 192.168.11.128. So now we have this, that's 128. So for us to know the network of S2, we then check for the increment of S1, total host increment of S1, that's slash 26. Slash 26, the total host increment is 64. So you come back here, 64, and then you add in 64 to 128. What you get is what will give you the network address of S2. So 64 plus 128, that's 192. So 192.168.11.192. Now, our host, total usable host given from our topology was 24. So we'll then check for the prefix length where 24 usable first host on the follower. We get our 24 here. So the prefix length will be slash 27. So you come back here and write slash 27. Now the next thing is for us to know the network address of S3. So you add up the increment from S2, that's the total host increment of S2 to the network address. So how will we know our total host increment in S2? That was slash 27, so we do look at slash 27. What's our total host increment? The total host increment is 32. So 32 plus network address of S2. So that's 32 plus 192, and that's 224. So let me use another pen. 192.168.11.224. Now, the next thing is the prefix length. So the prefix length, we'll have to look at our host given 8 hosts. So we'll go back here, check where can we get 8 usable hosts. Here the highest is you can have is 6 usable hosts. So our 8 falls under here, under 14. So what's the prefix length for 14? Slash 28. Prefix length for 14 usable hosts is /28. So you add your /28. So the next thing we do now is to assign a network address to S4. So remember, what's the increment? Total host increment, sorry, for /28. Total host increment is 16. So we are going to add 16 to the network address of S3. So 16 plus 224 is 240. So our network address will now be 192.168.11.240. Next is our prefix length. What prefix length represents two usable hosts? So let's go to our usable hosts. These are our two usable hosts. Remember, when you see hosts in a topology, it refers to the usable host. So our prefix length will be /30. So this will be /30. So the next thing now in our table is, sorry, I may have to delete these. You can check the because we need the space. So the next thing we do now is for us to know our first usable IP address. So let me type it in, or we need, yes, first usable IP address. I don't know why. First usable IP address. We have our last usable. I may have to switch space, and then we have our broadcast. Broadcast address. When you see the address, refers to the broadcast address. Last usable IP. So now for this, for us to know the first usable IP address, all you need to do is add 1 to the network address. So this formula, these are my list of formulas which you shouldn't forget. So the next thing formula is first usable IP address is equal to network address of, let's say, first usable IP address of A is equal to network address of A plus 1. So for S0, it was 192.168.11.0. So for our first usable IP address will now be 192.168.11.1. Now, for our last usable IP address, what we do is we add our usable host increments for that prefix length. That's, let's say for this now it's /25. We check for what is our usable host increment. Remember, I said usable host increment, and then we add it to our network address. So let's go from our subnetting table /25. What is our usable host increment? Our usable host increment is 126. So we are going to add 126 to C, usable host increment. So we are going to add 126 to our network address, and that will give us our last usable IP address. So 192.168.11.0 plus 126 will give us 192.168.11.126. So let me write it. Here's the formula. Last usable IP. I will advise you to get a notebook and write these formulas. Will then be network address of usable IP address of A plus usable host increment increment of A. So, and how you know your increment, of course, you have to make use of your prefix length. Yeah. So the next one now we check for, okay, then we proceed to our broadcast address. Understanding your broadcast address is not that difficult. All you need to do is just add 1 to your last usable IP address. So that's the next formula. Let me, we need another color. So broadcast address of A will then be last usable IP address of A plus 1. That's how you get your you get your broadcast address. So the last usable IP address of this 192.168.11. It's 126. So we add 1. It will now be 192.168.11.127. So now let's do for S1. So it will now be /26. So our first usable IP address will be the network address plus the usable host increment. So for /26, what is our usable host increment? /26 usable host increment is 62. So you add 62 to your network address. 62 plus 120. Sorry, our first usable IP will be our network address plus 1 first. So that's 192.168.11.129 will be our first usable IP address, 11.129. It's when we come to the last usable IP address that we add our increment. So our increment for /26 is 62. So we add 62 to our network address, and that's 190. So 192.168.11.190. Then the broadcast address will just be plus 1, and that's 192.168.11.191. Then for S2 now, we'll then look at it /27. So our first usable IP address will be our network address plus 1, that's 193. So we have 192.168.11.193. Then the last usable IP will now be our network address plus the increments in plus the usable host increment in /27. So let's go with /27. Here is it. So our usable host increment is 30. So 30 plus 192, that's 222, and that will be our last usable IP. So 192.168.11.222. This will be our last usable IP address. Then the broadcast address will just add 1 to it, and that's 192.168.11.223. Now, for 8, we then look at it. Our first usable IP address will then be our network address plus 1, and that's 192.168.11.225. Then the last usable IP address will now be our network address plus our increment, our usable host increment. Remember the word usable. So last usable IP address will be network address plus usable increment, usable host increment for that prefix length. So our prefix length was /28. So we look at /28. What is our usable host increments? This is 14. So we then add 14 to the network address of that layer. So that's 192.168.11.224 plus 14. Sorry. And and that's 214, that's 238. So 192.168.11.238. Our broadcast address will just be +1, and that's 239.192.168.11.239. Now for /30 will then be our first usable IP address will just be +1, and that's 241. So 192.168.11.241. Then our last usable IP address will be the increments, usable host increment plus the network address, and that's 2. So we add 2 to it. That's 192.168.11.240 plus 2, and that's 192.168.11.242. And then our broadcast address, of course, will be 192.168.11.243. So that's just it. If you want to get, now, let me summarize again. If you're given topology, the first thing you do is look at your topology, look at the number of hosts given. You arrange your hosts in descending order from the highest to the lowest. The next thing you do is you draw your subnetting table where you have your prefix length, your total number of hosts, and the usable hosts. Each represents an increment. So for /24, you have 256. Usable host will be 256 minus 2, and that's 254. For /25 is 128. And then when you deduct 2 from 128, it's 126. Remember, you divided 256 by 2, and that's how we got our 128. And you subtracted 2 from each to get your usable host. You had to subtract 2 because you removed your network and your broadcast address. The next thing is for you to know how to identify your network address. You draw a table where first you have your host, network address, and prefix length. So now when you arrange your hosts in descending order, the one with the highest host, you go to your table and check 70. You go to your table and look for the prefix length that corresponds to that number. Your usable host from topology, since ours was 70, so where does 70 falls under? 70 falls under 126 usable hosts. So you look at the prefix length that comes with 126, and that's /25. The next thing you do is now the network address. The first network address is the same network address that was given to you, but the prefix length changes. So the prefix length corresponds to the usable hosts given from your table. And then your first usable IP address is your network address for that layer plus 1. The last usable IP address will now be the network address of that layer plus the usable host number you have from your subnet table under the same prefix length. And that's how you get it. Then your broadcast address will now be your last usable IP plus 1. Here are the formulas. You can take your time and look at them, and then leave your comments, leave your replies in the comment section. If you have any issue, you can contact me. Thank you very much. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a good day.